The words hit me like a freight train. I know you're my real mom, Aunt Cass. My 18-year-old nephew Ethan stood in my doorway, tears streaming down his face, holding a crumpled DNA test in his trembling hand. For 18 years, my family had convinced him I was just his devoted aunt. They had no idea I'd been waiting for this moment since the day they stole him from me. My name is Cassandra Wells, but everyone calls me Cass. I'm 37 years old, and I work as a pediatric nurse here in Portland, Oregon. If you're watching this, please drop a comment telling me where you're from. Hit that like button if you've ever felt betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, and subscribe to Revenge with Nick, because what I'm about to tell you is the most devastating betrayal imaginable, and it took me 18 years to get my revenge. I've always been different from my family. While they valued appearances and conformity, I chose my own path. I never married, focused on my career, and built a stable, independent life. But there was always this aching emptiness inside me, a grief I couldn't explain. For nearly 2 decades, I thought it was because I'd lost my baby in a tragic accident. I was wrong. I hadn't lost him at all. Let me paint you a picture of the Wells family dynamics, because understanding them is crucial to this story. My parents, Richard and Margaret Wells, are the kind of people who care more about what the neighbors think than what's actually right. Dad's a retired insurance executive. Mom was a stay-at-home wife who lived for her bridge club and church committees. Image was everything to them. Then there's my sister Valerie, 3 years older than me and the undisputed golden child. Valerie followed every rule, married her college sweetheart at 23, bought a house in the right neighborhood, and tried for years to give my parents the perfect grandchildren they desperately wanted. But Valerie had a secret struggle. She couldn't get pregnant. For nearly a decade, she tried everything: fertility treatments, specialists, even experimental procedures. Nothing worked. My brother Trevor is 35, right between Valerie and me. He's the definition of middle child, never rocks the boat, follows my parents' lead on everything, works some middle management job at a logistics company. Trevor's not malicious, but he's weak. He'll go along with anything to avoid conflict, even when he knows it's wrong. And then there was Ethan, my nephew, the light of my life for 18 years. From the moment Valerie brought him home from the hospital, I was obsessed with that baby. I told myself it was just because I was a pediatric nurse, that I had a natural affinity for children. But it was more than that. Something deep inside me felt connected to him in a way I couldn't explain. If you're enjoying this story so far, please subscribe for more content about family secrets and betrayal. Trust me, this is just the beginning. Ethan looked exactly like me as a baby. Same dark hair, same gray-blue eyes, even the same small birthmark on his left shoulder. When I mentioned the resemblance to my family, they'd laugh it off. He looks like the whole family, Mom would say. Strong Wells genes. But I saw photos of myself at his age, and it was like looking at the same person. I became the devoted aunt. I was at every birthday party, every school play, every soccer game. When Valerie and her husband went on date nights, I was the first person they called to babysit. Ethan and I had this incredible bond. He'd run to me at family gatherings, confide in me about school problems, even ask my advice about girls as he got older. But there were always these strange moments. Comments from my family that didn't quite make sense. Don't get too attached, Cass, my mother would warn when I'd spend too much time with Ethan. He's not yours. The words always felt like a knife to my heart, but I thought she was just reminding me not to overstep as an aunt. Valerie was possessive of Ethan in a way that seemed almost desperate. She'd get visibly agitated if he showed me too much affection. If he called me for advice instead of her, she'd sulk for days. I attributed it to her being an overprotective first-time mom, especially after struggling so hard to have him. What I didn't know was that every smile, every hug, every "I love you, Aunt Cass" was actually my own son showing me the love I'd been denied for 18 years. Every family dinner where I watched Valerie parent him was me watching someone else raise my child with methods I disagreed with, while being told I had no say because I was just the aunt. The cruelest part was how my family used my grief against me. See, they'd convinced me that my baby died in the same car accident that put me in a coma 18 years ago. For nearly 2 decades, I carried the guilt of that loss. I threw myself into my work as a pediatric nurse, thinking I was honoring his memory by caring for other people's children. But Ethan wasn't dead. He was right there, calling me Aunt Cass, asking me to teach him to drive, to help him with college applications, to be there for all the moments that should have been mine as his mother. And my family watched it happen, knowing the truth, and said nothing. I need you to understand how deliberate this was. This wasn't a split-second decision made in crisis. This was a calculated, long-term deception that required coordination, lies, and the active participation of multiple family members over nearly 2 decades. They let me grieve a child who was alive. They let me believe I was broken, that I'd somehow failed as a mother before I even got the chance to be one. But here's what they didn't count on. They raised Ethan to be curious, intelligent, and honest, traits that would eventually lead him to the truth. And they underestimated how much a mother's love can endure, even when she doesn't know she's a mother. The story I'm about to tell you spans 18 years, but it really begins on a rainy night in November, when I was 19 years old and 8.5 months pregnant. I was driving myself to the hospital because I thought I was in labor, and I was terrified but excited to finally meet my baby. That drive changed everything, but not in the way I thought. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a feeling deep down that something wasn't right, even when everyone around you insisted it was? Drop a comment and let me know, because that intuition, that mother's instinct I didn't even know I had, is what eventually led me to the truth. What happened next would tear my family apart, expose decades of lies, and ultimately give me back the most precious thing they'd ever stolen from me. But it would also teach me that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are capable of the most devastating betrayal. Stick around, because this story gets much darker before it gets better. And if you think you know how this ends, trust me, you don't. Let me take you back to where it all began. I was 19 years old and a sophomore at Portland State University, majoring in nursing with dreams of helping children. I had my whole life mapped out: graduate at 22, work in pediatrics, maybe travel for a few years before settling down. I was responsible, focused, and determined to make something of myself. But life had other plans. His name was Marcus, and he was everything my parents would have hated. He was 21, rode a motorcycle, had tattoos, and came from what my mother would call the wrong side of town. But he was kind, funny, and he made me feel alive in ways I'd never experienced. We dated for about 6 months, and I genuinely thought I was falling in love. When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified but not devastated. I knew it would change my plans, but I also felt this overwhelming sense of protectiveness for the life growing inside me. I made an appointment with Marcus to tell him the news, planning exactly what I'd say. I even bought a little pair of baby booties to surprise him with. He never showed up to that coffee shop. When I finally reached him by phone 2 days later, his response was brutal. "Are you sure it's mine?" he asked. When I said yes, he told me he wasn't ready to be a father and suggested I take care of it. When I said I wanted to keep the baby, he said, "Then you're on your own." He transferred schools the next week. I never saw him again. If you've ever felt abandoned by someone you trusted, hit that like button. Because that abandonment was nothing compared to what my own family would do to me. I waited 3 more weeks before telling my parents, hoping I'd figure out a way to make it sound less catastrophic. I should have known better. I called a family meeting on a Sunday after church, thinking the religious setting might make them more compassionate. I was so naive. "I have something important to tell you all," I said, my hands shaking as we sat in their pristine living room. "I'm pregnant." The silence was deafening. My father's face went through about 5 different shades of red before he finally spoke. "Please tell me you're joking, Cassandra." "I'm not joking, Dad. I know this isn't what anyone planned, but what will people think?" My mother interrupted, her voice shrill with panic. "Our reputation in this community, Cassandra. Your father's position at the company. My standing in the church auxiliary. You've ruined everything." Not once did they ask how I was feeling. Not once did they ask if I needed support. Their first, second, and only concern was how my pregnancy would reflect on them. Valerie, who had been trying to get pregnant for 3 years at that point, looked at me with pure hatred. "Do you have any idea how unfair this is?" she said, tears in her eyes. "I've been trying everything, specialists, treatments, prayers, and you just accidentally get pregnant and ruin your life?" "I'm not ruining my life," I said, finding some courage. "I want this baby. I'm going to love this baby." Dad slammed his hand on the coffee table, making my mother's porcelain figurines rattle. "You're a sophomore in college, Cassandra. You have no job, no money, no husband. How exactly do you plan to raise a child?" "I'll figure it out. I'll work, I'll get financial aid, You'll give it up for adoption," he said, his voice final. "To a nice family who can actually provide for it. That's the responsible thing to do." But I refused. For the first time in my life, I stood up to my parents completely. "No," I said. "This is my baby, and I'm keeping him or her. I'll drop out of school if I have to. I'll work 3 jobs. But I'm not giving up my child." The ultimatum came the next day. Dad called me into his home office, the same room where he'd helped me with homework as a kid, where he'd taught me to balance a checkbook. Now it felt cold and intimidating. "Here's how this is going to work," he said, not even looking up from his paperwork. "You have 2 choices. Give the baby up for adoption through a reputable agency, finish school, and we'll support you through this difficult time. Or keep the baby and you're completely on your own. No financial support, no family support, and no place in this house." "You're talking about your grandchild," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm talking about a mistake that doesn't have to define your entire future," he replied coldly. But I didn't budge. I moved into a tiny studio apartment near campus, worked 2 part-time jobs, and continued my studies while pregnant. It was exhausting and isolating, but I was determined to prove them wrong. My baby and I were going to make it, with or without their approval. My family cut me off completely. No phone calls, no visits, nothing. The only contact I had was when my mother would send Valerie to check on me, though it felt more like surveillance than concern. Valerie would report back on my living conditions, my health, whether I'd changed my mind about the adoption. Subscribe if you want to hear how the story gets even more twisted, because what happened next changed everything. As my due date approached, I started having what I thought were labor pains. It was November 15th, around 10 p.m., and I was alone in my apartment. The contractions were getting stronger and closer together. I called my doctor, and she told me to come to the hospital immediately. I should have called an ambulance, but I was young and scared and trying to save money. I thought I could drive myself the 15 minutes to the hospital. It was raining hard, one of those Portland downpours that makes the roads slick and visibility almost zero. I was 3 blocks from the hospital when it happened. A drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of my car at full speed. The last thing I remember was the sound of metal crushing and this overwhelming fear, not for myself, but for my baby. When I woke up 6 weeks later, the world had changed forever. The doctors told me I'd suffered severe head trauma and had been in a medically induced coma while my brain healed. During that time, they said, I'd had an emergency C-section to save my baby's life. But then they delivered the news that shattered my heart into a million pieces. "I'm so sorry," the doctor said, sitting beside my hospital bed. "Your baby didn't survive the trauma from the accident. The injuries were just too severe." I remember screaming. Actually screaming until my throat was raw. The grief was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This primal, animalistic pain that felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside. They had to sedate me. My family, who had ignored me for months, suddenly appeared at my bedside. My mother held my hand while I sobbed. My father actually looked sad, maybe even guilty. Valerie was there too, offering comfort and support. "We're so sorry, sweetheart," my mother kept saying. "We should have been there for you. We should have supported you through this." "The baby's been buried," my father said quietly. "We handled all the arrangements while you were unconscious. We didn't want you to have to deal with those details." Even Trevor showed up, awkward but trying to be supportive. "I'm sorry, Cass," he said. "I know how much you wanted this baby." For the first time in months, my family was united in supporting me. They paid for my medical bills, helped me move back home to recover, and gave me all the love and attention I'd been craving. I was so grateful for their support during the darkest period of my life. What I didn't know was that they were comforting me for a loss that never happened. While I'd been fighting for my life in that hospital bed, my parents had orchestrated the most elaborate and cruel deception imaginable. My baby hadn't died. He was alive, healthy, and had just been handed over to Valerie to raise as her own. While I grieved the loss of my child, Valerie was at home with him, finally getting the baby she'd always wanted. And my parents were the masterminds behind it all. The timing was perfect, they thought. Valerie had been trying to get pregnant for years, and here was a healthy newborn that no one outside the family knew about. I'd been estranged from them during the pregnancy, so there were no friends or extended family members who'd been tracking my due date. Marcus was long gone. It was the perfect crime. But they had to sell it. 3 weeks after I woke up, still physically weak and emotionally devastated, Valerie made an announcement at Sunday family dinner. "We have wonderful news," she said, glowing in a way I'd never seen before. "I'm pregnant." Finally, after all these years, it's happened. I was still so broken from losing my own baby that I could barely muster excitement for her. But I tried. "That's amazing, Val," I said, forcing a smile. "When are you due?" "Early spring," she said. "March, we think." The math was perfect. If she was announcing in late November, a March due date would make sense. I was too grief-stricken and still too medically fragile to think clearly about timelines or ask questions. I just knew that my sister was finally getting the baby she'd always wanted, and I'd lost mine forever. Or so I thought. What I've learned since then is that my parents spent those 6 weeks while I was in a coma orchestrating every detail of this deception. They used their connections and money to falsify medical records, bribe hospital staff to stay quiet, and create a paper trail that supported their story. They told everyone that my baby had died in the accident. They arranged for a fake burial with an empty casket. They even had a death certificate created. Meanwhile, they were secretly arranging for Valerie to legally adopt my son through a private adoption that they orchestrated themselves. The most twisted part? They used my unconscious state to forge my signature on adoption papers. While I was literally fighting for my life, unable to consent to anything, they were signing away my parental rights on my behalf. If this story is making you angry, please share it and subscribe, because this level of betrayal needs to be heard. When Valerie gave birth in March, I was there at the hospital, still recovering from my own trauma, but so excited to meet my nephew. The moment I saw him, something stirred in me that I couldn't explain. He was the most beautiful baby I'd ever seen, with dark hair and gray-blue eyes that looked startlingly familiar. "He looks just like you did as a baby, Cass," my mother said, watching me hold him. Strong family genes. As I looked down at this tiny perfect person, I felt a connection that went beyond normal aunt-nephew bonding. But I told myself it was just because I was still grieving my own lost baby. This was as close as I'd ever get to being a mother, so of course I'd be emotional. They named him Ethan. And from that moment forward, I threw myself into being the best aunt I could possibly be. I thought I was honoring my own baby's memory by loving Valerie's child. I had no idea I was actually loving my own son, the child I'd been told was dead. For 18 years, I lived with that grief and that guilt. For 18 years, I believed I'd somehow failed to protect my baby. For 18 years, I watched another woman raise my child while thanking her for allowing me to be part of his life. But the truth has a way of coming out eventually. And when it did, it would destroy everything my family thought they'd built on their foundation of lies. The revenge I would eventually get wasn't something I planned for 18 years. It was something that happened naturally when the truth finally surfaced. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't plotting and scheming, it's simply letting the consequences of people's actions catch up with them. And believe me, when the truth came out, the consequences were devastating. For the next 16 years, I threw myself into being the best aunt in the world. I told myself I was channeling my maternal instincts into loving Ethan the way I would have loved my own child. What I didn't realize was that I actually was loving my own child. From the moment Ethan could walk, he gravitated toward me in ways that seemed to frustrate Valerie. At family gatherings, he'd run past his parents straight to me. When he got hurt, he wanted Aunt Cass to kiss his scraped knees. When he had nightmares, he'd ask if he could call me instead of going to his mom and dad. "He's just attached to you because you spoil him," Valerie would say, but there was always an edge to her voice. "You need to establish better boundaries, Cass. He has parents." But I couldn't help myself. Being around Ethan felt like breathing after holding my breath for years. When I taught him to ride a bike, when I helped him with his science projects, when he'd fall asleep on my shoulder during movie nights, those moments felt more natural and right than anything else in my life. The resemblance between us was impossible to ignore. As Ethan grew older, people constantly commented on it. "He looks exactly like you did at that age, Cass," strangers would say. "Are you sure he's not your son?" They'd laugh, thinking it was funny. My family would laugh too, but their laughter always seemed forced. Strong family genes became my mother's standard response. But I started noticing how quickly she'd change the subject whenever someone mentioned the resemblance. The birthmark was what really got to me. Ethan had this small, crescent-shaped mark on his left shoulder, identical to one I'd had since birth. When I pointed it out to my mother, she dismissed it. "Lots of people have birthmarks, Cassandra. It's not that unusual." But it was unusual. The exact same shape, size, and location? I'd never seen anything like it on anyone else in our family. My parents and Valerie had this way of subtly discouraging my relationship with Ethan whenever it got too close. If I offered to take him on a weekend trip, suddenly Valerie would have other plans for him. If he wanted to stay overnight at my apartment, there was always some reason why it wasn't convenient. "You're not his parent, Cass," my father said once when I objected to Ethan being punished for something I thought was minor. "You get to be the fun aunt who doesn't have to do the hard work of actually raising him." Those words stung more than he knew. I wanted nothing more than to do the hard work of raising him. I wanted to be the one helping him with homework every night, dealing with his teenage attitude, worrying about his future. But I told myself I was lucky to have any relationship with him at all. If you're starting to piece this together, hit that subscribe button, because what I discovered next will shock you. The breakthrough came when Ethan was 16 and trying out for varsity soccer. He needed a comprehensive physical, and the doctor requested detailed family medical history to check for any genetic conditions that might affect his athletic performance. Valerie sent me to the appointment with him since she had to work, something she'd done countless times over the years. I was practically his emergency contact for everything: school, doctors, activities. Looking back, I realize how strange that was. What mother trusts her sister with so much medical responsibility for her child? Dr. Martinez, Ethan's pediatrician, was going through the family history form when he paused. "This is interesting," he said, looking at the paperwork. "Ethan, you're type AB negative blood, which is quite rare. But according to this form, both your parents are type O positive." As a pediatric nurse, I knew immediately that something was wrong. It's genetically impossible for two type O parents to have a type AB child. I felt this cold chill run down my spine. "Are you sure about their blood types?" Dr. Martinez asked me. I think so," I said, my mind racing. "Let me double-check with Valerie." That night, I casually brought up the blood type question at family dinner. "Hey, Val, Dr. Martinez was asking about blood types for Ethan's physical. You and Derek are both type O, right?" Valerie's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Why does it matter?" "Just for the medical records," I said, watching her face carefully. "He has AB negative, which is pretty rare." "Blood types can be complicated," my mother interjected quickly. "Sometimes the tests aren't accurate." But I knew better. Blood typing isn't complicated, and the tests are extremely accurate. Someone was lying. That night, I went home and started researching. I pulled out old family photos, looking for pictures of Valerie during her supposed pregnancy. What I found made my stomach drop. There were plenty of photos from before her announcement and after Ethan's birth, but very few from the months she claimed to be pregnant. The ones that did exist showed her at odd angles or wearing loose clothing. In the clearest photo, from what should have been about 7 months pregnant, she looked exactly the same size as always. I thought I was going crazy. I started questioning my own memories, wondering if grief had distorted my perception of everything. But the medical facts didn't lie. The blood types were impossible. Leave a comment if you've ever had a moment where everything you believed suddenly started crumbling, because that's exactly what was happening to me. I requested Ethan's birth certificate from the hospital, using my credentials as a pediatric nurse to access records I probably shouldn't have been able to see. What I found made me physically sick. The dates were wrong. According to the birth certificate, Ethan was born on March 18th. But I remembered Valerie announcing her pregnancy in late November, which would put her due date in August or September, not March. For a March birth, she would have had to get pregnant in June, but I clearly remembered her announcing the pregnancy in November. Unless she announced it in November, because that's when my baby was actually born. I started digging deeper into hospital records from my own accident. Most of them had been destroyed or lost, but I found fragments. Enough to confirm that a baby had indeed been born via emergency C-section during my surgery. A healthy baby boy. But I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. I started collecting Ethan's hair from his brush when I'd help him get ready for school events, telling myself I was probably wrong, that there had to be some other explanation. I sent the hair samples to a private DNA testing company, along with a sample of my own. The wait for those results was the longest 2 weeks of my life. Part of me hoped I was wrong, because being wrong would mean I wasn't losing my mind. But a bigger part of me hoped I was right, because being right would mean my baby was alive. When the results came back, I had to read them 3 times before the words sank in. 99.99% probability of maternity. Ethan was my son. My son. The baby I'd grieved for 16 years. The child I'd been told died in that car accident. He was alive, healthy, and had been right in front of me this entire time. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the DNA testing facility, holding those papers and sobbing. 16 years of grief, guilt, and pain suddenly transformed into rage so pure and white-hot I could barely breathe. They knew. My entire family knew that Ethan was my son, and they let me believe he was dead. They watched me suffer through the worst grief imaginable while my own child called me Aunt Cass and slept in another woman's house. Every birthday party where I'd bought him gifts, thinking I was honoring my dead baby's memory. Every Christmas morning where I'd watched him open presents from his real parents while I sat on the sidelines. Every time he'd hugged me goodbye and I'd felt that unexplainable ache in my chest, that was my maternal instinct recognizing my own child. Valerie had spent 16 years being called mommy by my son. She'd gotten his first word, his first steps, his first day of school. She'd been the one he turned to when he was scared, hurt, or excited. All while knowing she was raising my baby. But the cruelest part was how they'd used my love for him against me. They'd let me be the devoted aunt, always available for babysitting and help, always grateful for whatever scraps of access they'd allow me. I'd thank them for letting me be part of his life, never knowing I was begging for time with my own child. Subscribe if you want to know what I did next, because this is where the revenge really begins. I spent the next week in a haze of rage and planning. I couldn't just confront them. They'd had 16 years to perfect their lies. I needed Ethan to discover the truth himself, in a way that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. But I also realized something else. In 2 years, Ethan would turn 18. He'd be a legal adult who could make his own decisions about relationships and family. If I was patient, if I was smart about this, I could get my son back and make sure my family faced the consequences of what they'd done. They thought they'd gotten away with the perfect crime. They thought I'd never find out, that I'd go to my grave believing my child was dead while being grateful for the privilege of loving my nephew. They were wrong. And I was about to spend the next 2 years making sure the truth came out in the most devastating way possible. The little girl in me wanted to scream, to rage, to burn their world down immediately. But the woman I'd become, strengthened by 16 years of nursing sick children and fighting for what's right, knew that patience would be my greatest weapon. I was going to get my son back. And when I did, my family would finally understand what it felt like to lose everything that mattered to them. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't just exposing the truth, it's letting the people who wronged you destroy themselves when that truth finally comes to light. Holding those DNA results in my hands, every instinct screamed at me to march straight to my parents' house and expose everything. to grab Ethan and tell him the truth right then and there. But I'd learned something important over the years. Sometimes the most powerful revenge requires the most patience. Ethan was only 16. Still a minor, still legally under Valerie's control, still young enough that my family could spin this as a crazy aunt having a breakdown. If I revealed the truth too soon, they could potentially move him away, limit my access, or even convince him I was lying. I couldn't risk losing him again. No, this had to be done right. Strategically. And most importantly, Ethan had to discover the truth himself. So I made a plan. A 2-year plan that would systematically plant seeds of doubt, encourage his natural curiosity, and lead him to uncover the lies on his own. By the time he turned 18 and was legally an adult, he'd have all the evidence he needed to confront our family himself. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I wasn't going to manipulate or deceive him. I was going to encourage him to seek the truth using the same intellectual curiosity and honesty they'd raised him to value. I was going to use their own parenting against them. If you've ever had to play the long game for something that really mattered, hit that like button, because what I did next required every ounce of self-control I had. First, I started documenting everything. I created a secure digital folder with copies of all the evidence I'd gathered, the DNA results, the hospital records, the timeline inconsistencies, the old photos. I wrote out a detailed timeline of events, including dates, witnesses, and documentation. If this ever went to court, I wanted to be prepared. But more importantly, I started building a stronger relationship with Ethan without raising any suspicions. I'd always been close to him, but now I was strategic about it. I volunteered to drive him to more activities, offered to help with more homework, created more opportunities for one-on-one time. "You're so good with him," Valerie said one day when I picked Ethan up from soccer practice. "He really looks up to you." If only she knew how much those words cut me. My own son looked up to me, and she was taking credit for allowing it. "He's a great kid," I replied, watching Ethan in my rearview mirror. "You and Derek have done an amazing job raising him." The lies tasted like poison in my mouth, but I needed to maintain their trust. During our drives and study sessions, I started planting tiny seeds of curiosity about family history. Nothing obvious, nothing that would raise red flags. Just gentle encouragement of his natural interest in where he came from. "You know, you should do one of those ancestry DNA tests," I suggested casually while helping him with a biology project about genetics. "It's fascinating to see your genetic makeup." I did one last year and learned so much about our family history. "Really?" he asked, looking interested. "What kind of stuff did you find out?" "Oh, just interesting things about our heritage. You'd probably find it cool too. Maybe for your 18th birthday, we could do yours together." I was planting the idea early, getting him excited about it, so that when the time came, it would feel like his idea. I also started encouraging his interest in family medical history, using my nursing background to make it seem educational rather than suspicious. "It's really important to know your family's medical background," I told him during one of our conversations. "Especially as you get older and start thinking about your own health." "Has your mom ever given you a complete family medical history?" "Not really," he said. "Just the basics for sports physicals. You should ask her for more details. Things like blood types, genetic conditions, that kind of thing. It's important information to have." I watched him mentally file that away, knowing his responsible nature would eventually lead him to follow up on it. The genealogy angle was my masterpiece. When Ethan mentioned he needed to do a family tree project for his American history class, I jumped at the opportunity. "Oh, I'd love to help with that," I said enthusiastically. "I've been meaning to dig deeper into our family history anyway. Maybe we could make it a real project, interview relatives, look through old documents, really map out the Wells family tree." Valerie looked uncomfortable when I mentioned it at dinner. "I don't think we need to go overboard with a school project, Cass. It'll be fun," I insisted. "And educational. Ethan, we could start by gathering everyone's basic information, birth dates, marriage dates, that kind of thing. Then maybe look through old photo albums to find pictures for the presentation." What I was really doing was creating opportunities for Ethan to notice inconsistencies. When he started looking closely at dates and photos, he'd inevitably notice that the timeline of his birth didn't match up with the evidence of his mother's pregnancy. Subscribe if you want to see how this all unfolds, because my patience was about to pay off in ways I never could have imagined. Over the next year and a half, I watched Ethan grow more curious about family history. I'd accidentally leave genealogy websites open on my laptop when he came over. I'd mention interesting genetic traits I'd learned about in casual conversation. I'd suggest family activities that involved looking through old photos. "Look at this picture," I said one day, showing him a photo from Christmas when he was supposedly 6 months old. "You were such a cute baby. You can see how much you looked like me even then." He studied the photo carefully. "Yeah, we do look really similar. Mom always says it's the Wells genes." I agreed, letting him draw his own conclusions. I also started subtly questioning things about his early childhood in ways that seemed natural. "I still can't believe how much you weighed when you were born," I said once while we were cooking dinner together. 9 pounds, 2 ounces. "That's huge for a first baby." "Really?" he asked. "Mom never mentioned I was that big." "Oh yeah, you were enormous. In fact," I paused, as if trying to remember. "What was your birth length again? I feel like it was something unusual too." "I don't know," he said. I could ask her. These little seeds of curiosity were adding up. I could see him starting to pay more attention to family stories, starting to notice when details didn't quite match up. But the real breakthrough came when he started asking about my own pregnancy and loss. As he got older and more mature, he became curious about that traumatic time in my life. "Aunt Cass," he said one day when he was 17, "can I ask you something personal? About the baby you lost?" My heart nearly stopped, but I kept my voice steady. "Of course, sweetie. What do you want to know?" "I was just thinking about how hard that must have been for you. And, well, I was born just a few months after your accident, right? Did it help having a new baby in the family?" "It did," I said honestly. "Having you in my life definitely helped heal some of that pain. You've always been special to me, Ethan. More special than you probably realize." He looked thoughtful. "Sometimes I feel I don't know, like we have this connection that's different from how I feel with other aunts and uncles." "Is that weird?" "Not weird at all," I said, fighting back tears. "I've always felt connected to you too." As his 18th birthday approached, I started preparing for the final phase. I bought him an Ancestry DNA kit for his birthday, wrapped it with a card that said, "For the young man who's always been curious about where he comes from. Love, Aunt Cass." I also prepared a complete file of all the evidence I'd gathered, just in case he needed it. Photos showing Valerie wasn't pregnant when she claimed to be. Hospital records from my accident and his birth. The timeline inconsistencies. Everything he'd need to piece together the truth. But I didn't want to hand it to him. I wanted him to ask for it, to come to me when he was ready to hear the truth. Because when the revelation came, I wanted it to be his choice, his discovery, his decision to confront our family. The plan was almost perfect. But what I didn't anticipate was how emotional it would be to spend 2 years knowing the truth while watching my family continue their deception. Every family dinner where Valerie talked about Ethan's childhood memories that should have been mine. Every time my parents praised her parenting skills. Every time someone mentioned how lucky I was to have such a close relationship with my nephew. The hardest part was maintaining the facade with Ethan himself. Looking into his eyes, my eyes, and calling him my nephew instead of my son. Listening to him talk about his plans for college and his future while knowing I'd missed 17 years of his childhood. Watching him struggle with typical teenage problems and not being able to comfort him the way a mother would. But I held on, because I knew that in the end, patience would give me something no amount of immediate confrontation could, the unshakable truth, discovered by Ethan himself, with no way for my family to deny or explain it away. The day before his 18th birthday, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized that the grieving, broken girl who'd woken up from that coma 18 years ago was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait for the right moment to reveal the truth. Tomorrow, my son would become a legal adult. Tomorrow, the final phase of my plan would begin. And soon, very soon, my family would discover that their perfect crime had been unraveling for 2 years, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. If you're on the edge of your seat waiting to see what happens next, make sure you're subscribed because the confrontation that's coming will change everything forever. Ethan's 18th birthday fell on a Saturday. I arrived at the family celebration with his Ancestry DNA kit, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. For 2 years, I'd been building toward this moment, and now that it was here, I was terrified. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, handing him the wrapped gift. "I thought you might enjoy exploring our family history." He opened it with genuine excitement. "This is so cool, Aunt Cass. I've been wanting to try one of these." Valerie's smile looked forced. "Those tests aren't always accurate, you know. And they share your information with companies." "It's just for fun, Mom," Ethan said, reading the instructions. "Look, it says results take 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. That gave me time to prepare for whatever was coming next. The waiting was agony. I threw myself into work, spending extra shifts at the hospital, trying to keep my mind occupied. But every day that passed brought me closer to the moment when everything would change forever. Meanwhile, I continued my subtle encouragement of Ethan's curiosity about family medical history. During one of our regular coffee dates, I casually mentioned that he should get a comprehensive health screening before starting college. "You're going to be on your own for the first time," I said. "It's important to have baseline health information. Blood work, genetic screening, that kind of thing." "That's actually a really good idea," he said. "I'll ask Mom about our family medical history when I schedule the appointment." Perfect. I was setting up multiple pathways for him to discover the inconsistencies. If you're holding your breath waiting for this to explode, hit that like button, because what happened next changed everything. The call came on a Thursday evening in May. I was at home, making dinner, when my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. "Aunt Cass." His voice sounded strange, shaky. "Hi, honey. What's wrong? Can I come over? I need to talk to you about something important." My heart started racing. "Of course. Are you okay?" I need to see you. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. I paced my apartment, trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming. Part of me hoped he'd discovered the truth, but another part of me was terrified of the pain this revelation would cause him. When he knocked on my door, I could see through the peephole that he'd been crying. His hair was messy, his eyes red and swollen. In his hand, he clutched a piece of paper. I opened the door, and he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before: confusion, hurt, and something that looked almost like recognition. "I know you're my real mom, Aunt Cass." The words hit me like a physical blow. After 18 years of waiting, dreaming, hoping for this moment, I couldn't speak. I just stood there, tears streaming down my face, looking at my son finally seeing me for who I really was. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside, and he walked into my living room, still holding that paper. We sat on my couch, the same couch where I'd spent countless evenings helping him with homework, never knowing I was tutoring my own child. "The DNA results came back," he said, his voice breaking. At first, I thought there was a mistake. It said I had a close genetic match with someone named Cassandra Wells. "That's you, isn't it? Your real name?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. "But that wasn't the weird part," he continued. "The weird part was that it didn't show Valerie as my mother at all. No genetic connection. And when I looked at the estimated relationship, it said." He looked down at the paper. "It said you were most likely my biological mother." "Ethan," I whispered. "I went to Mom first," he said, and the word Mom sounded strange coming from his mouth now. I showed her the results, thinking there had to be some mistake. But when she saw the paper, her face went completely white. He started crying again, and every instinct in me wanted to hold him, but I wasn't sure if I had that right yet. She tried to lie at first. Said the tests were wrong, that these companies make mistakes all the time. But I kept pushing, and finally she just broke down. She told me everything. My heart was pounding. "What did she tell you?" "That you're my real mother. That you didn't die in the accident like they told me. That I've been living a lie my entire life." He looked at me with eyes that were so much like my own. "Is it true?" For a moment, I couldn't breathe. 18 years of waiting for this question, and now I didn't know how to answer it. Yes, I whispered. It's true. The silence that followed was deafening. We just looked at each other, mother and son, finally seeing the truth that had been hidden for so long. Why? He asked finally. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know, I said, my voice stronger now. Until 2 years ago, I believed you had died in the accident. They told me you died, Ethan. They let me grieve you for 16 years while you were right there. I got up and retrieved the file I'd been keeping, the one with all the evidence I'd gathered. When I found out the truth, I wanted to tell you immediately. But you were still a minor, and I was afraid they'd take you away from me completely if I revealed what I knew too soon. I showed him everything. The hospital records from my accident. The photos proving Valerie wasn't pregnant when she claimed to be. The timeline inconsistencies. The medical records showing our blood type incompatibility with Valerie and Derek. He studied each piece of evidence with the careful attention I'd taught him to apply to his schoolwork. My son was thorough, analytical, traits he'd inherited from me. This is insane, he said finally. My entire life has been a lie. Not your entire life, I said gently. You're still the same person you've always been. You're still kind, smart, funny, determined. You're still going to college in the fall. You're still passionate about soccer and terrible at math. He almost smiled at that. The only thing that's changed is that now you know the truth about where you came from. But you're my mother, he said, as if testing how the words sounded. You've been my mother this whole time, and I never knew. I never knew either, I said. But Ethan, every moment we've spent together, every conversation we've had, every time I helped you or supported you, that was me loving my son, even when I didn't know that's what I was doing. He was quiet for a long time, processing everything. Then he looked at me with an expression that broke my heart. I remember always feeling different with you. Like you understood me in a way no one else did. And I remember thinking sometimes that if I could choose my mom, I'd want someone like you. That's when I finally broke down completely. 18 years of suppressed maternal love came pouring out as I held my son for the first time knowing who he really was. I'm so sorry, I whispered into his hair. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for your first steps, your first words, your first day of school. I'm sorry I missed all those years. It's not your fault, he said, holding me tight. You didn't know. But they did. They all knew, and they let this happen. The anger in his voice was unmistakable, and I knew what was coming next. I want to confront them, he said. All of them. I want them to look me in the eye and explain how they could do this to us. Are you sure you're ready for that? I asked. Once we have that conversation, there's no going back. Everything changes. Everything already has changed, he said firmly. I've been living a lie for 18 years. It's time for the truth. Subscribe now if you want to see what happened when we confronted my family, because the explosion was bigger than anything I could have imagined. 3 days later, Ethan called a family meeting. He didn't explain why, just insisted that everyone needed to be there. My parents, Valerie, Derek, Trevor, and me. We gathered in my parents' living room, the same room where they delivered so many devastating news over the years. I could see the confusion on everyone's faces except Valerie's. She looked terrified, probably knowing that the moment she'd been dreading for 18 years had finally arrived. Thank you all for coming, Ethan said, standing in the center of the room like he was giving a presentation. I asked you here because I have something important to discuss, and I need everyone to hear it at the same time. He pulled out the DNA test results and placed them on the coffee table where everyone could see. These are the results from the Ancestry DNA test Aunt Cass gave me for my birthday. But they revealed something much more important than my ethnic background. My father picked up the paper, his face growing pale as he read. According to this test, Cassandra Wells is my biological mother, not Valerie. The room erupted. Derek started sputtering about test accuracy. My mother gasped and clutched her chest. Trevor just stared in shock. But my father's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and then resignation. Now, Ethan continued, his voice remarkably steady. I've already confronted Valerie about this, and she's admitted that it's true. So I don't want to hear any denials or explanations about test errors. I want to hear the truth about why my entire family has been lying to me for 18 years. The silence was deafening. Finally, my father cleared his throat. Son, you have to understand. We did what we thought was best for everyone involved. Don't call me son, Ethan said coldly. And best for who? Certainly not for me, and definitely not for my actual mother, who spent 18 years believing her child was dead. Valerie finally spoke up, her voice shaking. I am your mother, Ethan. I raised you. I was there for every fever, every nightmare, every soccer game. DNA doesn't make someone a parent. Love and dedication do. Love and dedication? Ethan's voice rose. You built our entire relationship on a lie. Every time you told me you loved me, you knew you were keeping me from my real mother. Every time you celebrated Mother's Day, you knew you were celebrating a fraud. That's enough, my mother interjected. Valerie loves you, Ethan. We all love you. Yes, the situation was complicated, but... Complicated? I finally found my voice. You let me believe my child was dead for 16 years. You watched me grieve, watched me blame myself for his death, watched me struggle with depression and guilt. And all the while, you were letting Valerie raise my son. My father stood up, his face flushed with anger. You were 19 years old, Cassandra. Unmarried, no steady income, no support system. We gave that baby a stable home with 2 parents who desperately wanted him. You didn't give him anything, I shot back. You stole him. While I was unconscious and fighting for my life, you forged documents and falsified records. You committed fraud and kidnapping. We gave him a better life than you could have provided, my mother said defensively. That wasn't your decision to make. The words exploded out of me with 18 years of suppressed rage. He was my child. Mine. You had no right to decide what kind of life I could or couldn't provide for him. Ethan looked around the room at all of them, his face a mixture of disgust and heartbreak. Do you want to know what's really messed up? He said. I spent my whole life feeling like something was missing. Like there was this connection I couldn't understand. And every time I felt closest to Aunt Cass, to my real mother, you made me feel guilty about it. You told me I was getting too attached, that I needed boundaries. He turned to Valerie, his voice breaking. You knew. Every time I ran to her instead of you, every time I asked for her advice, every time I said I wished she was my mom, you knew why, and you still tried to keep us apart. I was protecting our family, Valerie said through tears. I was protecting you from confusion and pain. You were protecting yourself, Ethan replied. From the truth. From losing the life you'd stolen from someone else. The confrontation continued for another hour, with accusations flying and justifications crumbling under scrutiny. But the most important thing had already happened. The truth was finally out, and there was no putting it back in the box. When Ethan and I finally left my parents' house that night, we both knew that our family would never be the same. Some relationships were about to be destroyed forever, and others were about to be rebuilt from the ground up. But for the first time in 18 years, my son and I were walking away together, finally knowing who we really were to each other. The revenge I'd waited so patiently for was complete. Not because I'd destroyed my family, but because I'd given them exactly what they deserved, the truth and all the consequences that came with it. The morning after our family confrontation, I woke up to find Ethan asleep on my couch. He'd refused to go back to Valerie's house, staying up with me until 3 a.m. talking through 18 years of lies and stolen moments. Looking at him there, finally in my home where he belonged, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since I was 19. Around 10 a.m., my phone started ringing. Valerie, my mother, my father, all calling nonstop. I let them go to voicemail. Mom, Ethan said, and my heart stopped for a moment before I realized he was talking to me. Can I officially move in with you? I can't go back there. I can't pretend everything's normal when my entire life has been a performance. This is your home now, I said, the words feeling like the most natural thing I'd ever said. For as long as you want it to be. That afternoon, we drove to Valerie's house to collect his belongings. She met us at the door, eyes swollen from crying, Derek standing helplessly behind her. Ethan, please, she begged. We can work through this as a family. Nothing has to change between us. Everything has already changed, he said, his voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. I need my things. You can't just leave, Derek said. We're still your legal guardians until you're 18. I turned 18 2 months ago, Ethan replied. I'm an adult. I can live wherever I want. As we packed his room, Valerie followed us around, pleading. I raised you, Ethan. I was there for every scraped knee, every bad dream. That has to count for something. It would count for something if it wasn't all built on stealing me from my real mother, he said, shoving clothes into a suitcase. Every time you comforted me, you knew you were comforting a child you'd helped kidnap. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how far this revenge goes, because the legal consequences were just beginning. Within a week, Ethan had made a decision that terrified everyone. He wanted to report the illegal adoption to the authorities. They committed fraud, he said as we sat in a lawyer's office. Document forgery, falsifying medical records, basically kidnapping. These aren't minor crimes. The lawyer, Patricia Chin, reviewed all the evidence I'd collected over 2 years. This is one of the most comprehensive cases of adoption fraud I've ever seen, she said. The systematic nature of it, the involvement of multiple parties, the falsified documentation, this could result in serious criminal charges. What kind of charges? I asked. For your parents, potentially conspiracy, fraud, forgery of legal documents. For the hospital staff who were bribed, malpractice, and evidence tampering. For Valerie, knowingly participating in illegal adoption proceedings. The thought of my family facing criminal charges should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt sad and inevitable. There's something else, Patricia continued. Because this involves medical malpractice and cover-up at the hospital, there's likely going to be a wider investigation. Other cases might come to light. She was right. Within 2 weeks of Ethan filing his complaint, the state launched a full investigation into Portland General's adoption and birth record procedures from the 1990s and early 2000s. 3 other families came forward with similar stories of suspicious adoptions and missing documentation. The local news picked up the story first. Local family's 18-year deception exposed ran as the headline in the Portland Tribune. Then the television stations got involved. If you've ever wondered what it feels like when your private family drama becomes public knowledge, let me tell you, it's simultaneously vindicating and overwhelming. The story had everything reporters love: a dramatic family secret, illegal adoption, a young man discovering his true parentage. But what really made it explode was the community's reaction. My parents had spent decades building their reputation as upstanding community members. Dad served on the city council. Mom led charity drives at their church. They were the kind of people who got invited to ribbon cuttings and fundraising galas. That reputation crumbled overnight. I always thought there was something off about that family, our neighbor Mrs. Patterson told the local news. Too perfect, you know? Like they were hiding something. The church auxiliary asked my mother to step down from her leadership position. Dad was quietly asked to resign from the city council. Their social circle, built on decades of carefully cultivated relationships, evaporated almost instantly. But the cruelest consequence was what happened to Valerie. She'd built her identity around being Ethan's mother. Her social media was filled with proud mom posts. Her friends knew her as the woman who'd finally gotten her miracle baby after years of trying. When the truth came out, she didn't just lose her son, she lost her entire sense of self. Valerie Wells Thompson has been living a lie for 18 years. One particularly brutal Facebook post read, "How do you look at a child every day knowing you stole him from his real mother? How do you celebrate Mother's Day knowing you're a fraud?" She became a social pariah overnight. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. She was asked to leave her book club. Even Derek's family started distancing themselves, horrified by the extent of the deception. The most devastating moment came when she tried to approach Ethan at his graduation ceremony. The whole community was there, and when she walked toward him, a visible silence fell over the crowd. "Ethan, please," she said loudly enough for people to hear. "I'm still your mother. I love you." "No," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "You're the woman who helped steal me from my actual mother. We're done." The crowd's reaction was immediate: whispers, stares, some people actually applauding Ethan's response. Valerie left the ceremony in tears, and that moment was captured on someone's phone and shared across social media within hours. Subscribe and share this story if you believe the truth always comes out eventually, because the community support we received was incredible. People rallied around us in ways I never expected. Former patients of mine at the hospital started sharing stories about what a dedicated nurse I'd been, how I'd always gone above and beyond for children in my care. The narrative shifted to frame me as the grieving mother who'd been betrayed by her own family. Cassandra Wells spent 18 years believing her child was dead while working to save other people's children. One letter to the editor read, "She deserves our support, not judgment." Local businesses offered us support. The coffee shop where Ethan and I had started meeting for our weekly talks put up a sign saying, "Cass and Ethan always drink free here." It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. The legal consequences continued to unfold. While criminal charges were still being considered, the civil implications were immediate. The hospital settled with us out of court for an undisclosed amount, enough to pay for Ethan's college education and then some. 3 hospital employees were fired for their role in the cover-up. Dr. Williams, who had signed the falsified death certificate, lost his medical license. The adoption agency that had facilitated the illegal placement was shut down permanently. But the most satisfying consequence was watching my parents face the reality of what they'd done. For 18 years, they'd convinced themselves they were heroes who'd saved a baby from an unstable teenage mother and given him to a deserving family. Now they had to confront the truth. They were criminals who'd stolen a child and destroyed multiple lives in the process. "We did it out of love," my mother kept saying in her voicemails. "We thought we were doing what was best for everyone." But love doesn't forge documents. Love doesn't bribe hospital staff. Love doesn't let a mother grieve a living child for 18 years. The ultimate revenge wasn't their public humiliation or legal troubles, though those were consequences they'd earned. The ultimate revenge was that the truth had finally set us free. For 18 years, they'd controlled the narrative. They'd decided who got to be a mother, who got to be a son, who got to be a family. They'd played God with our lives and thought they'd gotten away with it. But they'd forgotten something crucial. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And when it does, it brings justice with it. Ethan was mine again. Not because I'd fought for him or manipulated the situation, but because the truth had finally been allowed to emerge. He'd chosen me, knowing all the facts, understanding all the implications. We were finally free to be mother and son without secrets, without lies, without having to pretend our connection was anything other than what it had always been, the unbreakable bond between a parent and child. That was worth more than any revenge I could have planned. That was justice in its purest form. But our story wasn't over yet. The healing process was just beginning, and there were still more revelations to come. 6 months later, Ethan and I sat in therapy, learning to be mother and son after 18 years of being aunt and nephew. "The grief is complicated," our therapist explained. "You're mourning the relationship you should have had while building the one you have now." It wasn't easy. Ethan struggled with anger about the lost years. I struggled with guilt about the childhood I'd missed. But slowly, we built our authentic relationship. The family fractures were permanent. Trevor surprised everyone by apologizing first. "I was a coward," he said. "I knew it was wrong but was too afraid to speak up." My parents remained in denial, sending cards insisting they'd acted out of love. Valerie became the most tragic casualty, refusing to accept reality, driving by my apartment and sending gifts Ethan returned unopened. College became Ethan's fresh start. At Oregon State, he was just a freshman with a close relationship with his mom, the way it should have been from the beginning. "It feels normal," he told me during a visit. "When people ask about my family, I just say I live with my mom. No explanation needed." A year later, celebrating his 19th birthday as openly mother and son, he asked, "Do you ever regret how everything happened?" "It wasn't revenge," I said. Revenge would have been destroying them for destruction's sake. What I did was pursue truth and justice. I didn't want to hurt them. I wanted my son back. As I tell you this story now, Ethan is 20 and thriving. We talk daily, visit every weekend, plan holidays together. He calls me mom without hesitation, and my heart swells with gratitude every time. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it because the truth needs to be heard. My parents thought they could rewrite history, steal my motherhood, and I'd never be the wiser. But they forgot something crucial. A mother's love doesn't die just because you tell her it should. Now, every morning I wake up and get to be what I always was, Ethan's mother. Not his aunt, not honorary family, but his actual mother. I get to worry about his grades, celebrate his successes, and give advice he'll probably ignore like any normal college kid. That's not revenge. That's justice. That's truth finally setting us free. Sometimes the best revenge really is just living authentically and trusting that the truth will always find a way to surface. Thank you for listening to our story. Remember, the truth may be buried for 18 years, but it never truly dies. And when it finally emerges, it brings justice with it. Like this video and subscribe for more stories about family, truth, and never giving up hope. Because sometimes, the most impossible dreams really do come true.